And as at today, looking at the town hall meeting on security that was held in Borno State, the army is saying Boko Haram is completely been dealt with, completely, exactly, vanquished. So, a resounding hand of applause, even though unfortunate report that they killed one or two persons in the community. Shortly after that, the report was making the round. But Nigerians are saying, beyond the crisis in the northeastern part of Nigeria, there are others bedeviling the north-central part of Nigeria. And is the government responding to those crises as much as they did for Boko Haram? Have we seen decisive, deliberate, calculated effort and strategy put by this government to ensure that they end what the government tag the herders-farmers conflict? A lot of Nigerians will go with Fulani herdsmen are killing farmers, but there's a narrative coming from the government, which is the farmer-herders conflict. So how are they dealing with it? How are they responding to the crisis is what we'll be focusing on the show today. Yeah,
the interesting thing is that our guest today is someone who I believe has I dare say has the most considerable knowledge on this particular issue. And
he's a prof.
Yes, he's a prof. And I'm sure one of the first things I'd like to ask, and our guest obviously is Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who is a senior fellow of CDD and the former director of the same organization. Prof, you're welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Prof.
Thank you.
Prof, the first question I'd like to ask really is that we've always had farmers and we've always had herders. Well, why has the problem suddenly escalated in this period? I mean, over the past couple of years, it just grew. So out of something else, I'm wondering why. What has caused this?
It's not just suddenly escalating. The fact of the matter was that the turning point was the drought suffered in 1971-72 that led to rapid drying up of the Lake Chad, but also accelerated the southern movement of the Sahara Desert, which, as we all know, is gaining 1 to 2 kilometers every year as it moves south. What that meant is that the major grazing lands which used to be in the Sahel, in the northern part of Nigeria and the southern part of Chad, Niger, and Mali, has lost most of its pasture, and pastoralists have been forced to move south. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the growing population in the country. In 1950, Nigeria had 50 million people. Today we have 198 million people. And this growing population has meant farming has increased. And farmers are opening up new lands to cultivation. This means the land available for pastoralism has been reducing steadily over the years. Specifically, the farmer-herders crisis has been brewing since the 1980s, and these conflicts have been growing. One point about the conflicts: whenever you have pastoralism side by side with farming, there are always conflicts. In the past, up till the 1980s, those conflicts were easily resolved. The pastoralists, the herders, accept that when they damage crops, they have a responsibility to pay for that damage. And usually local authorities, the village heads, and the head of the Fulani community, or Ardo as it's called, will calculate the damage, and it will be paid and it will be settled. But what has been happening over the past decade in particular is that the number of conflicts have been increasing considerably. And as the numbers increase, the capacity to manage the conflicts have been decreasing. And what could have been easily settled in a matter of hours in the past will now be allowed to generate into a major crisis that will lead to the loss of lives.
Sadly, because with this, reading up reports, you have other African countries who have also grappled with this over time, and somehow they've managed to contain it. But like Razak said, all of a sudden you just see it taking one obnoxious dimension with the spate of killings being recorded, destruction in the wakes of all of this crisis. You start to wonder if there's not more to this than this conflict on the surface that we would just want to establish and say it's the drought. All of these things are tangible, and the effect of the weather, climate change, the growing population, the lines are no longer, the borders are now well defined. But in Nigeria, Prof, some of these things, it begs for further questions about what really is going on in the country.
Well, the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of conspiracy theories going around claiming that what we are seeing is not just a question of clashes between farmers and herders. All those conspiracy theories are essentially baseless. What we are seeing is actually conflicts between herders and farmers. There are specific issues that relate to the management of pastoralism that have been allowed to decay in this country. Specifically, for the past 100 years, there have been cattle routes that are designated and reserved for cattle to pass through. Nobody was allowed to farm on those cattle routes. Over the past 30 years, most of those cattle routes have been farmed. Now, what that means is that these herdsmen who've been following those routes for decades, for about a century, and know is dedicated exclusively for their use, and that dedication is by government ordinance. It is government that designated these cattle routes and said nobody should farm them. Suddenly they are farmed. The herdsmen believe this is routes dedicated to them. The farmers believe this is their farms. You can now see a change in the failure of management that has led to an escalation of conflict. If those cattle routes have been protected by government, then you wouldn't have had these problems. The other structural issue that I think we should put on record is that way back in the 1960s, the government of northern Nigeria thought that with growing population, eventually there's going to be an escalation of conflicts between herders and farmers. So they designated grazing reserves in areas where there were no farms and there were very few farmers. And the idea was to develop water resources and pasture in those grazing reserves, as well as provide veterinary services, so that you concentrate cattle in areas where there are very few farmers, and by so doing, you'll have very little conflict. These grazing reserves were enacted by law in 1965 by the government of northern Nigeria, and 417 of those reserves were designated. However, when states were created in 1967, that information of reserving specific areas, usually in forest zones, and the 417 grazing reserves in Nigeria, where you have 2 in Oyo State, you have 1 in Ogun State, all the others are in northern Nigeria. And the project of government was move these cattle into grazing reserves so that they are not near farmers. Now, government has not developed those grazing reserves. They have not produced water sources. As you know, animals need a lot of water. In some of the grazing reserves, the dams were built, but they were not put into use. If that has happened, then you wouldn't have had this gradual escalation of crisis that we are seeing today.
Interesting. There's seen that we see predominantly the middle belt in the crosshairs of all of this crisis. You start to wonder why. Is it something about the setting? You need to understand. I mean, we're looking at assets from Kaduna, Taraba, Nasarawa, Benue, Plateau. It just seems like it's mostly the middle belt part of the country that we see more of these conflicts going on. Is it something more about the weather there, or the routes are infringed on more there?
It's a question of the vegetation. As you know, the middle belt has what's called Guinea savanna, which is savanna with a lot of grass and a lot of shrubs and small trees. While the northern part of the Guinea savanna, which is called the Sudan savanna, has grasslands, and the Sahel has very little grass. Now, as this climate change occurs and the northern parts of the country dry, it means there's more fodder. There's simply more food for the cattle moving south. So it's not as if there's any other reason except the availability of grass and water resources in the middle belt. But it is important to point out that these conflicts are not only in the middle belt. There has been a very serious conflict between herders and farmers in Zamfara State and Katsina States, for example. And that has led to very large-scale killing of people on both sides. Unfortunately, the media is only interested in killings where you can show there's a difference of ethnicity and religion, and then it sells more newspapers. It becomes more sexy, as it were, as a news item. So when you look at the number of killings in Zamfara, there's hardly been any reporting of that killing, although it has been at
but then a guard was set up. We have a set up, I think I recall the president visiting there some time back, and they have a national guard, I've forgotten what it's called, against cattle rustling, which they established was the trigger for some of the killings there in the conflict. Maybe the response. So let's go to the response, because the response by the government will determine how the media will run with some of these stories. Let's look at how the government has tried to manage this conflict that you say predates this administration. The last administration had a bit of a challenge on their hand, particularly Plateau State. I was still in Plateau State working when there were tons of those reports of Dogonawa and the likes between herders and farmers that wiped villages out. So what are we seeing different approach to this menacing challenge that we have on our hands?
I think the response of government and the security agencies have not been adequate at all. The fact of the matter is, when people are killed, these are Nigerians, even if they are not Nigerians, and government keeps quiet. Government does not respond. Government does not go investigate and identify and arrest those who are culpable of those acts. Then people feel very upset, and they have every right to feel very upset. The key issue is that this thing has been going on for a very long time, and government has not really shown sufficient will to address the issues. And I am talking both at the policy level, but also in terms of the security dimension. At the policy level, government has not really adopted any policy to address the fundamental structural causes of the crisis. The cattle routes, for example, nothing has been done about it. Conflict resolution mechanisms, nothing set up. Providing grazing reserves for the cattle in places that are not highly populated, it has not been pursued. So there is a real lack of substantive policy responses on the part of government. Now, in terms of the security incidents also, the fact of the matter is when people are killed, the security agencies keep quiet, government keeps quiet, then people begin to analyze and think maybe there's a reason why that's happening or why that's not happening. But what we do know is that these incidents have been at a very high level through the regimes of Adua, Jonathan, and Buhari. So these are all leaders from different parts of the country. So you can't attribute what's happening to specific leaders, but what you can say is government's capacity to respond to the deteriorating security situation has not been up to scratch, and that in itself becomes a factor in further escalating the crisis.
But they keep the previous government set up the Jonathan administration set up an interministerial committee for this purpose, look into this issue and come up with policies that they can actually work to arrest the decline that you said talking about. And this current administration too has done has carried out similar projects, gotten people together, great minds together to try and find a way out of this situation. My question is this: Is it that the policies being drafted up to move forward are not effective enough, or government is just not effecting these policies? They're just having table talks and no action.
Well, I think you see in this country we are beginning to lose sense of what does policy mean. Increasingly, government pretends that policy is writing your intentions on a piece of paper. The Jonathan administration developed a policy approach. They even allocated, I think, 100 billion naira to invest in the implementation of the policy. But that was the end of the story. Nothing was done in practice on the ground to implement any of those things that they have put down on paper. And this administration has been extremely slow to develop a policy response. The first draft of their policy response only came out last week, which meant they had not taken this problem with the seriousness that it deserves. And government response, government action has been extremely slow and ineffective.
Okay, if you're just tuning in, we have Professor Buharimeter with us here in the studio as we interrogate response of the government on the herders' conflict. And we know that the Vice President has made some effort, met with leaders of thought, met with a few people to see how they can come up with a solution to dealing with this problem. They recently have thrown cattle colony up for discussion also, saying that that's one way the government wants to look at resolving these issues there. So let's look at some of the ideas being mooted by the government and they're pushing forward. The president wrote to the Senate saying it's unfair to say I haven't made any efforts, and outlined all that he's done in recent time, from ordering the IG to relocate to Benue State, which is with the flashpoints right now in the country, and then talking about cattle colony. So a lot of Nigerians have also interrogated that, asking if it's going to really be the solution to the problem, because states now have Taraba, Benue, they have legislated on it, come up with an act saying no to open grazing, which is going by what the Minister of Defense said and a few other people, even the IG and Neyati Allah, is the trigger why we're seeing more frequency in the attacks there. So you start to wonder, cattle colonies, ranching, is this long-term solution, even though short-term and long-term also, to dealing with this problem? Because we don't want to go 10 years down the road and we're still having similar conversation. Prof.
I agree completely with you. First of all, I want to say that the choice of the word colony is extremely wrong. It's very insensitive. It is actually politically mischievous. for the simple reason that there are some people who believe what's behind this crisis is an attempt to colonize them and take over their land. When people believe there's an attempt to colonize us, and then government comes out and says we'll set up cattle colonies on your land, government is looking for trouble. I understand what the Minister of Agriculture meant by the term cattle colony. What he meant is ranches, and that a number of ranches will be grouped together and will be called a colony. He's defined it about 3 times very clearly, but nobody's ready to listen because that word colony, that's the word they don't want. Government must be responsive. People say they don't want cattle colony. Call it another name, because that name has become a burden. That name has become a problem. And the Minister of Agriculture is very stubborn. Everybody has been telling him, you made a mistake by choosing that name. Nobody is beyond a mistake. Apologize to people, said you didn't know they will misunderstand it, and have another concept that will be more acceptable to people. He has to do that. There is no choice. You cannot sell the term cattle colony in the present atmosphere we have in this country. So he has to completely drop that term. Now, the issue of ranches, I think there's a consensus that ranching is the solution. The problem with ranching, however, is that you have to prepare for it. Because, first of all, the cattle we have in this country are very low quality cattle. The price of a cow is between 100,000 and 150,000. If you are going to buy grass to feed those cattle for 5 years, a cow will consume 1,000 naira of grass every week. So for a cow that you sell at 150,000, you can't buy hay to feed it, because at the end it doesn't make economic sense. Where people keep cattle on a ranch, it is high quality cattle, it is dairy cattle. When you go to Europe, every cow produces 50 liters of milk a day, which you sell. Our cows produce 1 liter of milk a day. You are not going to be able to set up a ranch based on these types of cows. So you have to, first of all, completely transmit to a different type of cattle whose value, whose capacity to produce milk is high, and therefore you can justify the investment. The second issue is this. These people with the cattle...
Prof, the second issue will take longer than 30 seconds.
Okay.
So let's allow Gabriel read his news at 7, then we'll look at the second issues. Please stay with us. I appreciate you for staying with us. Buharimeter continues as we interrogate government's response to the herders' conflict. Professor Jibril Ibrahim is our guest on the show. And before the break for the news, you talked about your concerns and reservation around the ranching. First one, it's a bit expensive getting hay for the cattle. Then you are going to build on the second issue around ranching.
Well, the second issue is, if you want pastoralists to become ranchers, you have to get them land, because the only group in Nigeria who do not have any land of their own are the herders. They roam from place to place and they do not have land. So if they are going to set up ranches, you have to arrange to provide land for them to use as ranches.
By provide, sell to them or lease, rent space?
No. This is where I'm talking about a policy. You have to develop a policy. The important thing is they can't go into ranching if they don't have land. So land in this country is in the hands of state governments. Land that is used by communities belong to that community. Government can acquire land, government can control land. So government has to find a way, that's the state government I'm talking about, to ensure that they do have access to land. But if you are going to set up a ranch, it's not just a question of land for the cattle to stay on. They need a secure source of abundant water. And that is very critical whenever you are engaged with keeping cattle. So the second element in transiting to ranching is the availability of land, together with the first point I made, which is improving the stock of cattle to cattle that can now give you enough milk for you to sell to justify the investments you are doing in buying food, hay, to feed the cattle. I think the third issue is just capacity building for these people. Dairy farms, for instance, are capital-intensive methods. They need people who are educated. They need people who are conversant with modern methods. What all this means is that you must have at least a 10-year transition period to move from pastoralism to ranching. And without that within that transition period, you have to provide a new stock of cattle with higher value. You have to, through whatever means, ensure that land for the ranching becomes available. And thirdly, you need to raise the capacity of the herders themselves to be able to manage a modern cattle farm. You need to be able to provide the necessary veterinary services and the whole paraphernalia of technologies that are required in dairy farming. When you look at what happened in Benue, for example, I recently had an opportunity to interview some of the herders from Benue, and what they said was, over the past 10 years, no herder has been able to buy land in Benue State. The communities have decided, and it's not today, they said for the past 10 years, never to sell land to a pastoralist for all sorts of reasons that I think Nigerians can understand. So when you pass a law saying they must immediately transit from pastoralism to ranching, and then you tell your communities not to sell them land, then your policy, your real policy, is simply to expel them away from the state, which is what they did. So they all moved to Nasarawa State. And what happened in Nasarawa State? With the massive influx of cattle from Benue to Nasarawa State, overgrazing became a problem in Nasarawa State. There are too many cattle for the food available. So now conflicts are multiplying between farmers and herders in Nasarawa State. So when you block people, when you impose a policy framework that makes it impossible for them to survive, you are laying the basis for more crisis. And what's happening today is that a lot of the cows are starving, and as the cows starve, the desperate herders then become more careless in terms of the control of their cattle, and they create conditions for more conflicts to emerge. What I'm saying is, government has to step in and look for a comprehensive solution that will meet both the interests of the farmers and the interests of the herders. It is possible. Farmers are saying, don't destroy our crops. That's very legitimate. Herders are saying, we need access to pasture and water for our cattle. That's very legitimate. The original solution of 1965 by the Northern Nigerian government is the only way out, which is designate these forest reserves, most of which are in northern Nigeria, and where there are very few farmers and a very low population. Herd the cattle into those areas so that you reduce contact and conflict between farmers and herders in the country.
Oh, okay. You still wonder if with urbanization and the expanding population, and you would not see buildings encroaching to those areas, because the way we're growing and expanding in Nigeria is even mind-boggling. The areas you drive by used to be forest region, and 10, 20 years down the road.
No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I did make the point our population has been growing very rapidly, especially in northern Nigeria, where people tend to marry very early and therefore have a longer period over which they produce children. The result is a very high growth rate. So eventually, even those forest areas will get populated. But I'm saying during the transition period between pastoralism and ranching, you can now move the pastoralists to those forest reserves where they can continue with open grazing within the forest zones, and that activity will not lead to conflict with farmers, because there are very few farmers in those zones.
Prof, I remember you mentioned control where you were speaking just now, and how the herders have to control their cattle. And I remember reading something in a paper that has your name as one of the signatories on tracking. And I felt that this was really modern for Nigerian cattle herders. But I don't know if you could shed more light on that, on how they could track their cattle with modern devices.
There are two issues in terms of control of cattle. The first has to do with what's happening within the community of herders themselves. That is to say, these pastoralists tend to send small boys as herders. These boys are not experienced in controlling the cattle, and as the age of the herders goes down, the incidence of crop destruction has gone up. So that's one issue to address. The second issue of control is that when you talk to this community of herders, what they are saying is people are not looking at how they are suffering, and their biggest suffering is from cattle rustling. People come with guns and seize their cattle and go and sell the cattle. And what they are saying is government should protect them. They should stop this cattle rustling that's leading to many herder families completely losing their cattle. It's in that regard that I raised the issue of the initiative of the Katsina state government of putting technology into it and putting these small things, transmitters, trackers, in the cattle. And what that does is that every cattle will have a number. So when you go and sell a cow, it's easy to check what's the source of this cow, to who does it belong, because the chip will have a specific number for the cow, and it will have the name of the owner and where that person is located. And I think that control mechanism could reduce the incidence of cattle rustling. Don't forget, we have a whole generation of Nigerians who don't know how these things were done in the past. Up till 1980, every herder has to pay tax on every cow they have. That meant government had an interest in holding regular census of cattle in the country and establishing their location so that they could tax them. Now, up till 1980, you cannot sell a cow without showing the documentation that you have been paying your tax on that cattle. Now, since 1980, that practice has disappeared in this country, and no cow has any documentation. In the 60s and 70s, people knew how many cows there are, where they are moving to, and these cows have a history in the sense that 3 years ago they paid tax when they were in Nasarawa State, then the following year they were in Enugu, and the third year they came back to Kano, So there's a whole life history of a cow in the documentation around taxation. Now there's zero documentation of cattle. You don't even know where those cattle are coming from, whether they've just entered the country from neighboring countries or whether they've been in Nigeria for some time. So I think this idea of using ITC and chips technology is something that can enable us at least address the issue of the identity of the cattle and being able to track them when they are stolen and sold.